A disclaimer for our listeners. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. We are not true crime professionals, merely enthusiasts. Our podcast is intended for mature audiences only, as it contains mature themes, situations, and language.
Each episode focuses on true crime events, ranging from extreme sexual assault to bestiality to murder. If that is not the ride you want to take with us, please stop listening now. If you choose to continue listening, we thank you. Grab your favorite mug of coffee and let's get into this week's cold-blooded killer.
Welcome to Cold-Blooded Brews, where chaos ensues.
I'm Christine.
And I'm Stephanie. And this week we wanted to jump into some stories that we both researched independently. So we do not know what the other one is going to talk about, but we're both going to tell stories about maybe some criminal misdeeds that the perpetrator didn't go about in the smartest of ways.
Or I took a little bit of a liberty there. Everybody's crazy in my story. Nobody's making sense.
Good. Well, I'm excited to hear about it.
Unfortunately, I do have to set the scene for you a little bit. Otherwise, the rest won't really make sense when we get to the crimes. Hopefully, everybody likes a little bit of history. So I'm going to be discussing what happened to Pope Formosus. He was likely born in Rome around 816, and he doesn't have much of a written background. In 864, Formosus was made the Cardinal Bishop of Porto Santa Rufina, Italy, by Pope Nicholas I. The Pope was also hoping that Formosus would succeed in converting the people of Bulgaria to Catholicism. So the church is trying to spread the word everywhere.
Yes.
Additional tasks assigned to Formosus include missions to France on behalf of subsequent popes, Adrian II, his reign started around 869, and John VIII, whose reign started around 875. But unfortunately, in 876, it is said that Formosus incurred the mistrust of Pope John VIII, presumably over a disagreement regarding the coronation of Charles the Bald, who became, with his coronation, Charles II. Much better name.
Charles the Bald. Please tell me he had a very thick head of hair and they just called him the Bald.
The strict historical facts are so scarce that we'll go with yes. It was a long flowing mane. So Pope John VIII sent Formosus to West Francia to ask Charles the Bald to become emperor, and he did, and he was crowned on Christmas of 875. In 876, shortly after that coronation, Formosus and some followers fled Rome.
Uh-oh.
And it is important to note that at this point in history, the Holy Roman Empire was fractured and there was a lot of unrest and disquiet among the people. Throughout this, the papacy was actually the deciding body that determined who would be crowned emperor. And this is where a lot of our trouble starts in this situation. The church was the center of political power, but it was a very cutthroat environment where the church and the papacy are the epicenter of power and influence, religiously, spiritually, and politically. But by its very nature, that's going to breed instability, scandal, outrage, and even murder.
Ooh, scandalous.
The church is really just flying through popes. There were a lot of them in a very short period of time.
Oh, it's not a, really super stable job?
It is not. I don't know why anybody would have wanted it, honestly.
Power, and they thought, hey, if I can hang on to this power for a little bit.
Yeah, but some of them it was like 15 days, 20 days. I wouldn't be like, I'd like all the power for a little over 2 weeks.
2 weeks, yeah.
That's worth my life.
I'd rather take a vacation on the beach for 2 weeks.
Yeah, I'd be like, I'll go away while you guys settle this. So after Formosus and his associates suddenly and mysteriously fled Rome in 876, they were ordered to return to Rome by Pope John VIII, and they did not. So they were excommunicated from the church.
Shocker. I don't think I'd want to go back either.
No. I thought that was a little extreme, though. I mean, again, but we're talking about not too long past the time where, like, crucifixion was seen as, like, an appropriate response to crime.
I mean, the Pope is the next thing to God, so if you directly disobeyed...
Yeah, I'd be like, I'm a little suspicious, John. I don't want to... Could we maybe send letters about what this is about?
Meet on some neutral ground, perhaps?
Yeah. So the group had fled to one rival entity in the kind of fractured state of Rome, and it was the Spoletos, and they were under the Duke of Spoletos' protection, and he was an adversary of Pope John. So I guess that's why Pope John didn't really want to travel, because something might have happened to him.
Oh yeah, I'm sure that there was a lot of people that were not for the Pope at that time.
Yeah. But then a lot of people who supported the Pope, and
thus goes on for the whole rest of history.
So Formosus later traveled from the realm of the Spoletos, and he went back to West Francia. And that, again, is where now Emperor Charles the Bald, Charles II, that's where he was from. At this point, John VIII sent out letters claiming Formosus and his followers were traitors to Charles's kingdom, and that Formosus was a rival of the papacy in 872. And just to explain what papacy is for people who maybe don't know, that is the jurisdiction of the Pope. So he exists as the Bishop of Rome, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, and the head of the Vatican government. So basically, Pope John VIII is sending out letters saying Formosus and his followers are traitors to the Roman Empire and Charles's reign, as well as John VIII's position. Anybody in power, I guess.
He's the enemy of everybody.
Yes. So those letters were sent out in 872, and nothing really came of it. Everybody's still just hiding. And 6 years later, in 878, Pope John VIII traveled to West Francia seeking aid against the Spoletos. But while he was there, he met with Formosus, and Pope John VIII agreed to unexcommunicate him if he swore an oath to never return to Rome and never try to become a bishop again.
Seems simple enough.
But
you can be part of the church, but you can't be in power, and you can never come back to Rome where you're probably going to die. I'd be like, oh, cool.
That works for me.
It's fine. Sounds like a good deal.
But in 882, Pope John VIII, who ruled for 10 years...
Was he one of the longest ruling popes at that time?
He was, yes.
Oh, okay. It's a lot longer than 2 weeks.
Well, because he seems to have no problem being like, if you're against me, I'll kill you.
Yeah. That'll keep you in power
for a while.
He had a
very strong, murderous front. And he was not afraid to show that side of himself. But ultimately, he was assassinated. He was actually poisoned, and it took too long for that poison to take hold and kill him. I don't know exactly who assassinated him, and I don't know what their timeline was.
Right.
But they decided it took too long, so they bludgeoned him to death with a hammer.
Oh, I wonder if they, poisoned his dinner, and then he went to bed, and he didn't die in his sleep, so they were like, you son of a... Just whack, whack, whack.
I don't know, but that doesn't sound like a great... You're already nauseous, probably,
right?
And, not feeling good, and then somebody's just
maybe
bludgeoning you.
Maybe you went to, the toilet to
I don't
puke.
Think
well, I guess they didn't have toilets.
Out the window.
But did they have, an outhouse, or is this the time where they were, doing their business in buckets and tossing it out?
Yeah, I think it was, pots.
Oh. I just imagine an outhouse, and he leaned over it, and then they clubbed him. That'd be so great.
What a terrible end for a terrible guy. So, he was assassinated. Pope Marinus I was his successor. He absolved Formosus of his oaths that he had made back in 878, and he invited him back to Porto Santa Rufina. Formosus and his followers returned to Rome in the 880s, and he was then restored as the Cardinal Bishop of Porto Santa Rufina. Remember, this was a time of rapid turnover with respect to the position of Pope, and Pope Marinus really only had about a 1-year rule, followed by Pope Adrian III, who ruled again for about a year, and then Pope Stephen V or VI, he ruled for 6 years.
5th or 6th? We don't know how many Stephens there were?
We do not.
kind of funny.
We don't know. Again, record keeping, not great.
Not great.
A later successor is noted in the Catholic Encyclopedia Journal of Clinical Anatomy that he was Stephen VII. So that would suggest then that this was Stephen VI. But in research, it's, one number / the other because
who knows? All right. The Catholic Church didn't keep an accurate tally of, maybe Stephen the Fifth was like only there for a week. So they're like, not even worth writing down. But this one guy was like, he was my favorite pope, so we must include him.
Maybe. But over time, Formosus' influence grew until finally he was elected pope and succeeded Pope Stephen V or VI in October of 891. Pope Formosus served for approximately 1,460 days or close to 4 years. And his rule had its share of troubles. Again, there was a huge political power problem that the Pope was just sort of in charge of trying to unite everybody.
So the church was trying to take over the world.
Yes.
Okay.
So Pope Stephen V or VI, he crowned Guy of Spoleto as the Holy Roman Emperor in 889, and his son was crowned co-emperor. But Formosus didn't really like this, so he asked King Arnulf of Germany to come and liberate Rome. Basically, conquer all of the land all the way to Rome from Germany on this little trail, and he would then crown King Arnulf as the king of the Holy Roman Empire, which would then extend the reach, even further. And it took a long time, but slowly Arnulf took land throughout Italy, and by 896 he finally made it to Rome, and he was crowned emperor by Pope Formosus.
That is a long-ass trip.
Yes.
That took forever.
Yes. After that, King Arnulf went to attack the Spoletos, but he was seized with paralysis and forced to return to Germany. Shortly after, Pope Formosus died himself. This is again in 896, and the discord was left unresolved until Arnulf himself died that same year, and Pope Stephen VI or VII, who was Formosus' successor, supported Lambert from the Spoleto, and he became the Holy Roman Emperor again anyway.
Okay.
So he lost a year of rule to King Arnulf.
I hope he went on a vacation. It's like, screw you guys, meh.
Yeah, bye.
Fine.
It was somewhere else.
I do picture him as like one of those spoiled little fat kids because his dad was the emperor, so he's like, meh.
Sitting in a corner
You
pouting.
took my job, meh.
So now we have Pope Stephen VI or VII, but really we're going to call him Pope Petty Crazy Pants.
I like it.
Because 9 months after he took over as Pope, Pope Petty Crazy Pants decided to hold a synod, which is like a church trial.
Okay.
Would you like to know who he was charging with some crimes?
I would love to know, because if his name is Crazy Petty Pants, I need to know.
He brought charges against his political enemy, the deceased Formosus.
What? Dude, that's been dead for like 9 months.
Yes.
So rotting in the ground.
Yes. And for the trial, he did not stay in the ground.
Oh, no.
He was actually dug up, put in, papal finery, and seated on a throne, and his corpse was just treated to this trial.
What? How? How does that even...
Well, first we have Pope Crazy Petty Pants, and
Okay.
he's kind of the prosecutor,
Okay.
as well as the
Judge, jury, executioner of the
Yes.
already dead man. Got it. Okay.
correct. And then you have Pope Formosus as the defendant.
Rotting corpse.
Yes.
Dressed in very nice clothes, sitting on a throne.
Yes.
Okay.
And then a deacon had the role of not only being almost the public defender of Formosus, but he was also required to crouch behind the throne that had the dead, rotting body on it. And he had to respond to the charges that Pope Crazy Pants was just screaming at Formosus because he was really emotionally involved in this trial.
Did the deacon, like, Weekend at Bernie's him, like, tie some string to his arm to his and, like, make his fist shake as he's yelling?
Well, I assume so.
God, that would have been amazing.
But he was probably a little more subdued because the deacon was not supposed to yell back.
Oh, okay.
He was supposed to pretty much be like, yeah, I was a really bad guy. Maybe like head hanging. Maybe the deacon didn't even have to do that because I don't know what pose he died in. But maybe it was convenient and his head was already down.
Looking very remorseful.
Yeah.
As he rots. Gross.
I would also love to know, like, how long did this trial last for? Was it like an afternoon? Was it a week?
Right?
Pope Stephen seems to have a lot of rage, and I'm just wondering how long everybody let him go on for.
And just watch this show.
Yes.
Like, that's... Wow.
So, Pope Stephen accused Formosus of violating canon law, perjury, and a number of other lesser charges, all which were alleged to have occurred during the papacy of Pope John VIII, which was 20 years ago. So it kind of reminds me of, you know how President Putin in Russia seems to have a lot of resentment towards political things that happened in the 90s.
Right.
And he just holds on to that now, like more than 20 years later.
Yeah.
That's what I feel like Pope Crazy Petty Pants was doing.
I want to know how old he even was at 20 years before. Like, what?
That is a good
Why
point.
does it matter to him so much?
The point is it did matter. It mattered a great deal. After the trial, which went on for who knows how long, Formosus was found guilty
Shocker.
by Pope Stephen.
I'm so surprised.
Of course he was found guilty, so at this time, his election as Pope was declared invalid. His acts as Pope, blessings, benedictions, those were all made invalid. The 3 fingers on his right hand, which were used for consecration, were actually cut off. Then his, again, rotting body was thrown into a commoner's grave as an insult. But later, when Pope Stephen probably felt like this wasn't humiliating enough, the decaying body was dug up and then thrown into the Tiber River by Pope Stephen.
He just loves digging up this corpse. Like,
I guess.
Let's dig it up and put it on trial and then bury it. Oh, let's dig it up again. I thought of something else.
Of something else. This is going to top my last attempt at humiliation. It was suspected that Stephen was insane.
Whoever came to that conclusion is a real, like, thinker.
They really summed it up.
Yeah. I know it was quite the reach to get there, but...
So, a monk later recovered the body of Formosus and buried it again, but not in his original, obviously, burial spot. He was again placed in a commoner's grave.
That was really nice of him to fish his body out of the water and bury it.
I assume he was somebody who supported Pope Formosus as opposed to Pope Stephen. But right around this time, the people of Rome decided that Pope Stephen was crazy and embarrassing and they had had enough. So they stripped Stephen of his Pope title and put in someone more qualified for that position.
The cow, like in the pasture? Because, wow, was this dude
anybody.
a psycho.
So Stephen was removed as Pope and he was put in a jail. And in August of 897, he was strangled to death by people who supported Pope Formosus. The next pope was Pope Romanus, and he overturned Pope Stephen's conviction of Formosus. He was only in power for less than a year, so Formosus was still left in that commoner's grave until Pope Theodore II was the next succeeding pope. He recovered Formosus's corpse, so he got the body, but because he was only in power for 20 days, it was his successor, Pope John IX, who reinstated for Moses as a pope and reburied him in his original tomb at St. Peter's Basilica.
Oh my God. His poor corpse has traveled around so much.
Yes. So Pope John IX also made a very important rule, apparently. It's one of those rules you didn't know you needed. But he condemned Stephen's synod, burned his axe, and made it illegal to put a dead body on trial.
Well, that's good. Like that should have never happened in the first place. The whole thing is crazy.
Yep. So that's my story.
Oh, that took a lot of turns. Crazy turns.
But now we know we won't have any more trials of dead people.
Good.
Way to go, Pope John IX.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
My story is also international because as I was researching for this topic, the crimes I was finding in America were just so dumb that they barely even got into their crimes before they were caught. Like, I could tell you about 10 or 15 in the time it would take me to tell you about just this one. So I wanted something with a little more substance, you know.
Spin me your yarn.
All right. It's a little more recent.
That's great. We're not in like the Bronze Age.
No. So we're going to start out in Poland, November 13th, 2000. A man by the name of Dariusz Januszewski leaves his office after receiving a strange phone call. So his assistant overhears him repeating back the instructions on this phone call to meet at Trails End Road. And he writes it down. And he leaves his office. And she is very nosy. So she peeks out the window to see him leaving and notices that he might have been followed by a man.
Was she like always nosy?
Sure, we'll go with that.
Well, I'm just wondering, like, she was just like, I heard what street he said. Was she not doing her own job?
I mean, she was in the office with him and just happened to, I doubt it was a very big office. Okay. They were in there working on some things.
I tune out people a lot of the time, so I would just be like, I don't know, he left.
Just worth mentioning that more than one source did mention that she was nosy.
So this is like common knowledge.
She was probably really into his business.
I wonder if like neighbors were just calling the police, like, ask her, she's real nosy at home too. She won't stop staring out her blinds. Like, who was that on Bewitched, that neighbor?
Oh yeah,
it was an old lady name, but peeking out the blinds. Telling her husband to come look.
All the neighbors I've ever had on every military installation.
I guess so.
And that's the last time anybody sees Dariusz Januszewski. Because on December 10th, 2000, his body was found by fishermen in the Odra River. He was bound by what's called a backward cradle. It was a noose around his neck, connected by a rope with his hands tied up around his back. And it's used to cause the noose to tighten anytime you move or make the slightest wiggle. The autopsy revealed that he was beaten and starved for several days before ultimately dying of strangulation. They also noted that they couldn't 100% determine if he was actually dead when he was tossed into the river or died shortly thereafter.
Oh my God, that's even more horrible because you've got to like flail to swim.
Right, so he could have just strangled himself faster. So the case was actually closed in mid-2001 because they had absolutely no leads. And, quote, it was an inability to find the perpetrator or perpetrators.
So, and I don't know, can you do that? I thought they were like cold cases.
This is Poland, so
Poland's like, meh.
Sure, their law enforcement's a little bit different. And it said like closed, kind of in quotation. So maybe it was just set on the back burner. It wasn't officially like, we're done with this case.
But they couldn't go anywhere with it.
They weren't actively investigating it anymore.
Okay.
So probably much like our cold cases here.
Okay.
So about a year and a half later, Jack Robleski was an investigator for the police department, and he conducted a routine review of unsolved cases. So much like going back and reviewing cold cases. He realized that they never recovered Darius's cell phone.
Well, but it was 2000, right?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe not everybody had one, but he did have one, and nobody ever found it. So they used the IMEI number to track the phone, and it showed that it's actually been sold multiple times. It's bounced around to different users. I don't know how they were I have no idea. But there was a long list of
Okay.
sales. And so the first sale was on a Polish auction site, and it was sold on November 17th, 2000, 4 days after his murder.
Like an auction site,
Like an eBay. It was sold by username Chris B.7. And they traced the username back to Christian Bala.
All right.
All right. So his name Christian spelled like K-R-Y. And his username was the CHRIS.
Well, maybe he thought he was being sneaky. Like,
Right.
I'll just put down Chris B. .7.
Yeah. I don't know. But a little bit about Christian Bala. He's an author and a traveler. He has a master's in philosophy. And he actually wrote a novel called Amok.
I have not read it.
Spelled A-M-O-K. It did not do very well. It's not like
Is that why I haven't heard
a
of
New
it?
York Times bestseller, okay?
But he tried.
But it was published in 2003. They couldn't initially interview Christian because he was traveling in Asia since about 2001. They discovered that his book, Amok, which became part of the police's investigation. And so they're reading through this book that he wrote about a protagonist named Chris, spelt with the C-H-R-I-S. He describes the murder of his lover, Mary. And it was quoted by David Gran as sadistic, pornographic, and creepy.
Like the whole book?
The whole book, apparently. But anyway, the police were struck by the parallels between the book and the murder of Darius.
I will just bet they were.
They thoroughly read his book to look for clues.
Little Easter eggs in his novel.
A little bit. So some of the most important parallels were the rope used by the killer, in both were similar. The selling of the crime-related items by auction on the internet. A motive of jealousy. Because they thought, because somebody took days with Chris and it was torturous, that it had to be some sort of jealous revenge type of motive. So there were specific characteristics of Chris in the book that mirrored Christian, such as alcohol abuse, promiscuity, and a fascination with philosophy. It also mirrored a lot of Bala's life, traveling the world, filing for bankruptcy, and even stealing the statue of St. Anthony from a church.
That can't be good for the soul.
No.
Probably none of those things, but especially that last one.
Right? And being obsessed with your ex, partner, or wife. The book was boasted by the media, because they caught on to this also, as a, quote, roadmap to the crime.
Oh.
However, the whole book was rejected by the court and not treated as evidence because it is a work of fiction.
Yeah.
So as much as the parallels were there, they couldn't actually submit, oh, Your Honor, he wrote down that he tied the rope around the neck.
Well, isn't that kind of what we're dealing with here in the United States with rappers who rap in songs about murder and then they're trying to figure out if it can be used in court?
Right. Is it an artistic expression? And where does that line?
Yeah.
So we'll talk about some real evidence that didn't come from the book, as the police are looking through Darius's phone records. Because remember, they got this phone call. That phone call actually came from a payphone. So they couldn't trace where that phone call, that last phone call came from. Right.
Did they call the office or did they call his cell phone?
Cell phone. So they're going
That's
through.
unusual, no? For 2000? If you have an office?
I would think so. But he was a marketing guy. So maybe he gave out his cell phone number to clients.
Okay.
So they did find this one number that had a few short conversations. And so they followed up on that number. And it was somebody that they hadn't heard of or talked to before. And her name was Stacia. Stacia happens to be Christian's ex-wife. So as they go to talk to Stacia and they say, how did you know Darius? She at first says she didn't know him at all.
I just call him sometimes for 5 minutes.
Well, they showed the phone records. They say, well, he called you, you called him. So how did you not know who he is? After a little bit, she's
I was returning that unknown call.
She's like, well, we had a little brief fling shortly after I left my husband, but it was nothing serious. We met a couple of times, we talked, but we didn't really hit it off. Bala was a really jealous person. People had said that he had gone off on her, when she would talk to some strange guy in the bar, he would go off on her. And that's part of the reason why they split and divorced. So that right there links him to Darius through Stasha and gives him a possible motive for the murder.
Yeah.
So Bala was first arrested and interrogated in September of 2005 when he returned back to Poland. Because remember, while they're going through all of the book and the clues and everything else, he's not even in the country. So they can't talk to him at all. He claims, and there's nothing to back this up, so this is much like Arthur Shawcross, he claims that he was actually walking out of, I don't know if it was a cafe or a market or a deli, something, and basically he had a bag thrown over his head and he was kidnapped and told to lay down in the back of a car and taken to some abandoned warehouse-ish, almost like the freaking KGB came and like picked him up, and he was tortured and interrogated by the Polish police and forced to confess to the murder of Darius.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's his claim. So there was an internal investigation in 2006 into that. I mean, they took it seriously. They looked into it. There was no corroborating evidence
of them, because
at all.
I would have been like, I don't believe you.
Yeah, there's nothing that they found. So during his first interrogation, the one that's not made up, he claimed that he didn't know Darius at all and that he'd never heard of him. And then on a different occasion, he changed his statement and he admitted that he killed him. He said just after the confession, though, he claimed that he didn't feel well. He wanted the interrogation to stop. And he goes back and said, well, I didn't say that.
I would have been like, that's fine. We can stop. We got the important
Right.
parts.
He recants his whole confession and he refused to sign the affidavit of his confession. So even despite that, though, there was witnesses' testimonies. There was other gathered evidence on Christian's computer at work that had materials and search things linking to
how to tie that knot.
Pretty much, yeah. Like how to commit this. So February 22nd, 2007, he was brought to trial. And during the proceedings, the prosecutor's office presented 14 pieces of circumstantial evidence to indicate that the suspect committed the crime. So they had nothing super concrete. They had a big pile of circumstantial evidence. He was found guilty of luring the victim out of his office and imprisoning him for at least 3 days, during which Darius was beaten, starved, as well as bound, stunned, and thrown into the river. And on September 5th, 2007, the defendant was sentenced to 25 years in prison. December 20th, 2007, the Court of Appeal remanded his case. So he tried to appeal the results. December 20th, 2007, the Court of Appeal held up his case. He was trying to appeal it based on that there was just circumstantial evidence. They didn't really have anything concrete,
no smoking gun.
Yeah, tying him to that murder. But he was once again sentenced to his 25 years in prison. They're like, no. May 2009, the Court of Appeal upheld the second verdict. He tried to do it again. And so it was rejected by the Supreme Court of the Republic of Poland. So all the legal remedies were exhausted. So it's presented frequently as a really spectacular case in Poland because it was so sensationalized by the media. And actually, when I first looked it up, I found author, jailed for book that he wrote, confesses. Even the Daily Mail wrote that it was a media frenzy and that he wrote about the murder of a Polish businessman and blah, blah, blah. Well, they didn't read his book because it was about the murder of his wife, Mary. But yeah, they would have never really connected him had he not, wrote parallel story about the murder. Like, a lot of his book was fictionalized, but a lot of the stuff in there was what actually happened. And B, frickin' sold his cell phone on an auction site and it tracked it back to him. Like, I would have just
thrown it in the river too.
And I don't know if he just didn't think he would get caught. I think maybe he thought he was too smart.
Maybe he was a very poor author who really needed. His book was self-published.
And it only sold a couple thousand copies. So it was not this like beaming success that like some of the media made it out to seem.
Yeah.
But I thought that like, that's a pretty dumb way to get caught.
Just don't write a book with step by step how your murder was planned.
Oh, but I changed the characters.
They'll never guess now. Instead of Darius, it's
Mary.
That's not even close.
I kept my name. the same
They
username
don't care
that I
if-
used
if they-
online to sell them.
He's like, I changed it from a K to a C.
Totally different.
Added that 7.
They're never going to figure
Wash
it out.
my hands of that. All right. So don't write your crimes in a book.
No, don't do that.
And
Don't take corpses to trial.
you're not allowed anymore.
If you know of any dumb criminals that just
Fascinate you?
Yeah.
You want to tell their story?
let us know.
We would love the opportunity to engage with our listeners, so please feel free to email us.
At coldbloodedbrewspodcast@gmail.com,
Or you can follow us on
TikTok at Cold Blooded Brews, or Instagram at Cold Blooded Brews Podcast.
and those are all one word, no spaces. Well, then I'll cut it off.
I think on all of those there's no spaces.